Hi everyone, I'm Ray. In this video, I want to show you the process of sewing my Mint Phantom cosplay from scratch. This is not really a tutorial, but more so a vlog. But I'll try to add as much of the references or resources I used in the description. I had to buy a couple items for the cosplay aside from the fabric, so ribbons, bias tape, zippers, thread buttons. And I'm using bias tape for those thin pieces of fabric that are all around her costume, so I don't have to cut out thin strips of fabric all the time. I'm starting with the top half of her dress, and for this one I actually already have a bodice pattern that I used. I'll include the link to the tutorial I followed into the description. I made it a while back, and what I do is I just trace over it every time I need to make a new kind of top and adjust it depending on the shape of the top that I need to make. In this case, it's a kind of top with a sweetheart neckline, so I just adjusted the pattern a bit to crop it above the bust line. To avoid damaging my original bodice pattern, I create a completely new copy of it in a separate sheet of paper, and then on this new sheet of paper where I've copied the bodice is where I draw or mark out the adjustments that I need to make. And this is what it will look like after I've marked out what shape the top should have. And the next step would be to mark out the seam allowance. You'll notice some lines down the middle of my template. Those are for darts, and darts are for folding the fabric to give the garment more shape. In this case, it's to accommodate the bust of the clothing item. Because the top of Minto has a lot of stripes, these darts would kind of interfere with the stripe pattern if I keep them where they are right now. Because that's how my original pattern was set up. So I have to rotate the dart. And to rotate the dart, you'll notice that I've cut just one line from the original darts. And I'm now going to begin to cut a new line, which is where I want the new dart to be. And what this does is it will allow me to kind of fold back into place the original dart and cover up basically what would have been extra fabric, and then consequently expand the new line that I've cut out, and that becomes my new dart. The next steps are kind of boring, just tracing the patterns onto the fabric, cutting them. I mean, a lot of this is cutting fabric and tracing the pattern onto the fabric. So this might be the only time that I'm showing myself tracing fabric and cutting fabric, because it's kind of boring to watch. But yeah, like you'll see here that I'm marking out the dart because that's where I want to fold later on, and so that's the finished fabric pieces cut out. For the top, all in all, I cut out 2 pieces of the front piece and 4 pieces of the back piece. This is to account for the outside layer and also the lining. For sewing the top, I started by pinning down the darts. This is to make sure that I sew it correctly as stated in my pattern. And I start with the darts. Once the darts are done, then I sew the front piece to the side pieces. That looks kind of like this. And now that that's done, so begins my journey of making 5 billion ruffle pieces. And one caveat about this clip is I'm actually cutting out the fabric for the centerpiece of her top. And when you're sewing ruffles, you actually need like at least 1.5 times the length of the item you want to surround by ruffles. So I'm actually cutting the wrong length of fabric here. And I will notice that in a bit and kind of just cut a new piece of fabric later on, which will fit better onto the centerpiece. For Minto's ruffles, what I was doing was I was folding these long strips of fabric in half and then doing very loose and long stitch length straight stitches all along the length and doing kind of parallel lines, 2 parallel lines of that. And then what you want to do is take the threads that are at the bottom and pull those. So pulling those bottom threads will allow you to create the ruffle effect. I'm not sure how it works technically. I don't know how the sewing machine works exactly, but for some reason it's the bottom threads, not the top ones. And I don't know where the footage of the center tube went, but what I did was just do the same thing, sew along the length of a long piece of fabric, and then just turn it inside out. But once you have that kind of tube thing, now you can pin your ruffles onto it. My recommendation, start with one side of ruffles first, pin it, sew it, and then pin, sew the other side of ruffles. It's just much easier. And the fabric I'm using, it's called peach twill. It frays so much. I think maybe I should have been using pinking shears. I didn't know those were a thing that existed. But yeah, apparently that's real and it should have helped a bit with preventing fraying. And now you'll have something that looks kind of like this. It should go right down the center of the top. And the next step is to draw some lines all along the top. And this is where I'll be putting the white ribbon to mimic the striped look of her top. To save mental for the stripes here, because I'll be doing this a lot, not just for this top but also for parts of the skirt, I'm just gonna pin it down onto the fabric and then sew a straight line right down the middle. I know I tested it and it wasn't obvious that it was just one straight line, and it will look something like this. So this isn't even done yet. I still need to do the sides. But yeah, it looks pretty good. Once that's done, I recommend to iron it. You will notice I get progressively lazier and lazier with the ironing. I don't even film it towards the end, but know that I am ironing. I am ironing as much as possible because that is how you make sure that your finished product is as nice as possible. Next is I'm using the bias tape, and what I've done is I've pinned it down all the way around, and I'm going to sew on this fold, right on the crease of the fold, so that it will create the gold lining that's on her top. And once that's done, you'll notice because I've sewn right at the crease, it folds over very neatly. And the next step is to add the ruffles. And we're just kind of repeating the same thing. We're gonna be doing this ruffle thing a lot, so I won't be showing it a lot later on. But yeah, pretty much just sew parallel lines and then create the ruffles by pulling the bottom threads. Now that the ruffles are completed, the next step is to sew the ruffles onto the top piece along the top edge. And this is where it gets a bit tricky because we want to try to sew the ruffles onto the top right at the other fold of the bias tape. At least because of the way I'm doing it, I need to match the bias tape, but if you're just using like a strip of fabric, maybe you'll have an easier time. But for me, I'm trying to follow the folds on that's already on the bias tape. After I attach the ruffles, I then attach the lining. And normally, I think you would do this all at the same time. But because ruffles are kind of finicky to work with, I didn't want to sandwich them all together at once. I made sure that the ruffles were already attached in place, and then I sewed another time the lining on top of it. And another thing that I had to remember was that straps exist. I needed to make sure there was a hole where I could attach the straps. And for the straps, you guessed it, more long strips of fabric to make ruffles with. So I had 2 pieces of fabric for the length of the strap itself, and then another 2 pieces of fabric that are a bit thicker for the ruffle part of the straps. And the ruffles on her straps are a bit interesting because they are thicker at the apex of the shoulder and they get thinner as it gets closer to the dress itself. So I'll show that in the picture. So I had to kind of pin the ruffles in a particular way to mimic that shape. Kind of like with the top, I sewed just one side first just to get the ruffles in place, and you can see that it is thicker where the strap would be at the top of my shoulder and then gets thinner towards the ends of the strap. Before sewing the strap closed, I just trimmed off the excess fabric so that it's a bit less bulky. And these are the straps completed. They turned out really cute, and I think they were one of my favorite parts of sewing this costume. And now all I have to do is attach them to the dress. And later on, I kind of had to shorten the straps. I think I attached them a bit too long for me. And this is just me trying it on. I think at this point I was like not too happy with how it was turning out, but looking back, like I'm just overly critical. Then I sewed the buttons onto the top by hand. And for this one, I wish I had buttons that were more muted yellow in color, but this was what I got, so I just worked with it. Now for the skirt, is just a big rectangle and more long strips of white fabric to make ruffles again. And it's fairly straightforward. I just pinned the ruffles onto the main skirt fabric, which is this brown rectangle. And then I sewed them together, just making sure that the ruffles are on a good spot, I guess. And once I finish sewing them together, it should look something like this. And because I wanted to avoid the kind of messy edge at the back, I used bias tape all around the back to cover up the fraying threads. And this is because I don't have a serger, which should kind of make things neater, but I realized later on a way to kind of imitate the effect of a serger to prevent fraying. And I'll show that a bit later on though, because it just clicked to me very late in the project. But anyway, if it works, it works. Now there's no fraying edges, so it looks kind of neater than it used to. And the next step is to add the gold trim all around the bottom. And for that, I used again that gold bias tape and did a similar approach as what I did for the gold trimming on the top, where I sewed first on the bottom crease and then let that fold over and then did a top stitch all along the top of the bias tape. Now the next part of the skirt is the mint paneling, and I cut out 6 pieces of rectangles from my mint colored fabric, of course, and the length is just a little above the length of the main skirt panel, the brown fabric, and then the width should all add up to my waistline. And the idea is I want to recreate that kind of effect on her skirt where there's gaps in between where you can see the brown skirt peeking through. And because the mint paneling also has the white lines all around it, I did the same thing I did as with the top. I drew some lines onto the panels as like a guide, and then I sewed the ribbon onto the panels. And then I sewed the lining pieces and the front pieces together, right sides facing each other. And I sewed along the edges that did not need any gold trim. So you can see in the image, some parts of the panel have gold trim, some don't. For those sides that have no gold trim, I sewed them together, right sides facing each other. I flipped it around again and then did some ironing so that it's neat. And for the edges that do have gold paneling, I joined the pieces using the gold bias tape instead. In the end, it'll look something like this. And then once I have all my panels ready, just like with the ruffles, I like to sew it part by part. So I think I sewed the panels onto the top first, and then once I had the top and the panels together, then I attached the brown skirt. And to save mental, I didn't do the typical approach that I did where I sew parallel lines and then make the ruffles. What I did here was I pinned it, like I kind of just pinned it at different sections to create a ruffly effect. And yeah, that's what it looks like all attached together. And the next thing to do is attach the zipper. And fun fact about me is I've been sewing for a while now, but I've never actually sewn a zipper onto a piece of clothing before. Like, I always avoid it because I am very scared of adding zippers for some reason. So this is literally my first time adding a zipper ever. And I remember I made a mistake for the first time sewing, and then I had to seam rip everything again, and then I think I got it right the next time. So yeah, practice makes perfect, I guess. After attaching the zipper, I sealed up the rest of the skirt starting from the bottom, and the edges are fraying a lot here. I didn't film it anymore, but I did clean it up. I did clean it up in the end. This is just some footage of me noticing that the straps are a bit too long. Then I got started on the apron. This here is fusible interfacing, which is supposed to make fabric piece more firm. I also cut out the fabric strips for the brown ruffles. I cut out the semicircles for the apron itself, and also the fabric piece for the belt, which is what I attached the fusible interfacing onto so that it's a bit stiffer. And we're kind of back to regular programming, just making a lot of ruffles again. So this is the ruffles that go all around the semicircle, or all around the bottom of the apron. Once I kind of fluffed out all the ruffles, I pinned it onto the semicircle pieces of fabric, and after pinning it, I then sewed them together. Her apron also has a light blue ribbon detail all around. So I just pinned the light blue ribbon all around the semicircle and just did the simple top stitch around the very edge of the ribbon. And this is what it looks like now. After that, I started to prepare the belt section of the apron by pinning the brown bias tape all around the length of it, because that's kind of what it looks like on the model sheet itself. And kind of like what I did with the blue ribbon, I just did a top stitch all along the very edge of the bias tape. At the base of the apron's belt section, there's also brown ruffles all along the length of it. So that's what I sewed onto the belt next. After that, I sewed the semicircle part to the belt part. And at this point, I was kind of winging it, I remember, because I realized I wasn't really sure how to seal them together in a way that looks neat. So yeah, I kind of just did my best. That's all I can say. Yeah, I just tried to make sure that there was as little fraying ends as possible so that it stays neat, and the only messy parts is what won't be visible when worn. And I think this is the footage of me doing what I was talking about, just kind of doing a top stitch in a way that it's not too obvious, so that I could fold over the belt section and then seal all the ruffles, the place that I connected the semicircles to the belt in place. And then I just hemmed the ends of the belt at the sides by folding them over twice. And then I kind of tried to wear the apron and marked on the belt section where I need to sew my hooks. And the hooks are what I used as my closure. But in the end, I did also reinforce it with some Velcro, since I found that attaching the ribbon made it a bit too heavy and the apron needed a bit more security to stay closed. And this is what it looks like when worn. And then for the sleeves, it's kind of just two rectangles in the mint colored fabric that I cut a circle or a half circle around the sides, and then I cut out some garter pieces to gather them at the points that they need to be gathered based on the sheet design. I did first close the sleeve pieces by doing French seams along the length of them. And a French seam is when you sew them wrong sides facing each other, cut off the excess, and then flip it around and then sew it right sides facing each other, and then flip that around. And you'll find that when you've completed this process, you'll have a really clean seam where there's no fraying ends or anything because you've kind of sewed it first, flipped it around, sewed it again. Yeah. After sewing it together, I kind of sewed shut the area with the semicircle by just doing a rolled hem. It turned out a bit messy, but it's one of those sections of the cosplay that is not too obvious, I think. So it's okay. Next was the garter, and my goodness, I did not have an easy time. I think maybe it was the garter I used or the type of stitch I was using. I'm not really sure until now. Some garters I didn't have that much difficulty with, but for the thick one that I used for this dress, it kept on creating nests. Which is when the fabric gets all jumbled up at the bottom. And yeah, I had a very difficult time. So I just kind of kept sewing and then just folding over and then hoping that no one will see. The good thing is there's a ruffle detail that I could use to cover it all up. So this is me just making that now. All I did was make ruffles again and then add the brown bias tape all around it. And this is what the ruffle detail looks like after. I think I just hand sewed them. Next, I added the gold trim detail all around the end of the sleeve. And for this one, I did just do a simple top stitch again. I realized after the fact that I should have done this before sewing them together. But, that's just a lesson learned. And after adding the gold trim detail, I then sewed the ruffle detail at the end of the sleeve. And there we have it. The sleeve is done. I'm gonna do this again on the other sleeve. And if you think we're done making ruffles, we are not yet done. And this part is supposed to have ruffles, but I didn't add it because it's my first time making a collar. So for this one, I followed a YouTube video. You can see me watching that YouTube video, and I will try to remember to link it onto the description. But what I did was I actually just traced over a collar that I already have from a shirt that I know fits me, and then I made patterns out of that. I cut the pattern pieces out of the fusible interfacing. I ironed the fusible interfacing onto fabric, and then I cut it out with seam allowance included. And then I just followed the instructions on the video. I sewed the two collar pieces together. I would turn them inside out, and I'd sew the other collar pieces onto that one. Yeah, it was pretty interesting, and having the pattern just traced over from collar that I already own made things a lot easier. I do suggest if you're having a hard time sewing and coming up with the pieces of fabric that you need to cut out, you could just trace your clothes that you already have. It still does teach you a lot about pattern making and the clothing item itself. And then I started working on my big bows, and I used the same approach for the little bows, but generally there's like three pieces that you need to cut out. The first one is this kind of pentagon like shape. I have this pattern piece that I trace over a folded piece of fabric, and this is used to create the ends of the ribbon, the flowing ends of the ribbon. And then I cut out a longer rectangle, and then this is what I'll use for the main bow, or the fluffy portion of the bow. So you'll see here, when you open the pentagon piece, it looks kind of like, it actually does look like a bow, but you will sew it from one end to the middle, then the other end to the middle, leaving a gap in the middle so that you can turn them inside out in the end. And for the fluffy part of the bow, you just sew all along the length of the skinnier rectangle and then just turn it inside out. The last piece of fabric for the ribbon is just a much smaller rectangle, and that's what I use to seal the where I've joined the two main ribbon pieces. So you can see on the table I have the ribbon already prepared. I'm just sewing the small rectangle and then I'll sew them together. And this is what my big collar ribbon looks like. And now we have to go even bigger for the back ribbon. And for this one, I did the same thing. But for the fluffy part of the ribbon, I actually put fusible interfacing so that it holds shape. The ribbon also has some extra detail, and for that one, I just use like organza type fabric, and then just cut out more rectangles. I mean, this is just a lot of rectangles. And then for the tail, it was just like really long rectangles instead of the pentagon shape that I used, because I wanted it to be as long and flowy as possible. The piece of fabric that joins the ribbon pieces at the middle has some extra details like the gold trim and also the ruffles, so I just added that one too. Puppy break, guys. He's taken my seat. Anyway, I also found that I needed to add boning onto the middle part of the ribbon because it kept on getting crumpled up. So I had to add boning so that it will keep its cylindrical shape. And then before I sewed it together, I added this kind of pin-like structure behind the ribbon, because what I've learned is that it will get very heavy if you attach the ribbon onto the belt or the apron itself. The apron will get pulled down. It will just not look very nice. So I found a hack on YouTube Shorts that you can create some kind of hook and then hook the ribbon onto the belt. So I kind of tried to recreate that hack. I didn't have like a metal wire to do that, so I just used the boning, and then I guess it was close enough. It did end up sagging like on the day itself, but it was better than if I hung the ribbon directly onto the apron. This is me stress testing it. And then I started working on her hair accessories. For the triangle headband, I just cut out a piece of square and then sewed it together to make a triangle. And my plan was to just put it on a headband together with the ruffle headband. And for the ruffle headband, it's just a long strip of fabric that I sewed together and then flipped inside out, and then I sewed a little bit of the edge to create a channel through which I put the headband through, and then you can see me doing that right now. It naturally creates ruffles, and all I did was just tie it at both ends. And when that was done, I just tied the triangle piece onto the ruffles. And the last detail that I had footage of were the small ribbons. So all around her dress, there's little blue ribbons. She also has blue ribbon hair accessories. So I kind of just did the same thing I did before for the brown ribbons, but at a much smaller scale. And this is the finished cosplay. There's a couple things I would have done differently now that I've experienced it, but I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. Unfortunately, I didn't have a wig. I was trying to get one made, but it didn't get completed on time, so I just wore my hair as it is. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you had fun or learned something.